Welcome to Snipisode 21 of the Daily Dose of DMC podcast. Today is Monday, January 30th, 2023, and I'm your host, HK. Good morning, all you beautiful people, and welcome back to the Daily Dose of dedication, motivation, and commitment. And as always, I hope you guys had a lovely weekend. We spent a lot of family time together. We got a lot of chores done together. We got a lot of things crossed off our task list. It was busy, but it was beautiful, and I really hope you guys had the same. We are kicking off another amazing week this morning. Last week we talked about procrastination, stopping negative thoughts, nature, commitment through inspiration, that Japanese concept of ikigai, and I'm really excited to kick off this week with probably the infamous story of the mayonnaise jar and the two beers. And I want to give you the original story first, and then I want to highlight another similar story, and then I want to share a hybrid version that I watched probably 10, 11 years ago, over a decade ago, that really kicks in the meaning of a positive mindset and what the Daily Dose is all about. So let's look at the story of the mayonnaise jar and the two beers, which is simply, it's a story about perspective and attitude. It goes along the lines, something like this. I didn't look it up. It's just from my notes that I'm trying to recall here. I'm sure there's a YouTube video. Google it. It's about a professor who asks his class to consider that there's two jars, one filled with mayonnaise, the other with beer, and then there's also two cups, one filled with mayonnaise and the other with beer. And then he asks his students what the contents of those jars and cups represent. And some students answer that the jars represent life and the cups represent happiness. And then the professor goes on to explain that the contents of the jars and cups represent the same thing, life and happiness. The difference lies in the way that we as individuals perceive those contents. If one perceives life and happiness as half empty, the jar and the cup of beer, then they will be unhappy and negative. But if you perceive life and happiness as half full, then the jar and cup of mayonnaise, then they or you will be happy and positive. So that story is just meant to teach the importance of attitude and perspective in determining how you view happiness in your life. So I kind of broke that down just to make that a little bit more clear in my notes. So the first interpretation was from the students. So some students answer that the jar represents life and the cups represent happiness. The jar of beer represents a life that is perceived as difficult and challenging, while the jar of mayonnaise represents life that is perceived as easier and less challenging. So the beer for the students was unhappiness, while the mayonnaise represented happiness. But the professor's explanation explains that the contents of the jars and the cups represent the same thing, life and happiness. It's only the difference, like I said, is only the way you perceive those contents. And that is the importance of simply just perspective and attitude in life in general. And that's what I want you guys this morning to really take away, especially as we get down to the story I really want to share. So you can perceive life and happiness as half empty, then you will be unhappy and negative. But you can perceive life and happiness as half full, then you will be happy and positive. That's all this is about. It's just about that attitude and that perspective and determining how you see happiness. How you shape your own life, your own experiences. You are responsible for those, nobody else. As much as there's outside influence and whatnot, your viewpoint, how your mind translates that perspective, that attitude, how you choose to do that, half full, half empty, that's what's going to lead to a happier life. So that brings me to my second story, which is the professor and the jar, and it's a very similar story, but this story teaches more about prioritization and problem solving, and it goes along the lines of a professor bringing an empty jar to class, a mayonnaise jar, and he begins filling it with various items, and those include golf balls and pebbles, sand, and then ultimately water. And every single time he does that, he asks the students in the class, is the jar full? So he puts in the golf balls and he says, is the jar full? They reply yes, and he puts in pebbles on top of that and fills in, the empty space and crevices and asks again. And he does that all the way till he starts pouring in water. And this story is more, again, about teaching prioritization and effective problem solving, as those items, he then explains, represents tasks and responsibilities, the priorities you have in life. So the golf balls in this instance are the largest and most important items, and those are the ones that should be placed in the jar first, which are your most important tasks and those responsibilities in your day-to-day life. And the smaller items such as pebbles and sand, they begin filling in the spaces within the jar, so within your life, and they represent various other items such as like the water ultimately being time and energy. So in order for you to be able to handle all those tasks and priorities. So it's basically about starting with the most important tasks and working your way down to smaller. And this brings me ultimately to the story I really want to talk about today, which is also, it's a hybrid blog post I wrote on my blog as well. And I like to call it the same thing, the mayonnaise jar and the two beers. And it's something that, again, I watched over a decade ago, so I'm pretty sure you can go find it. I did not do this for this, but I have this down in my notes. And it's kind of like a hybrid between the two we just went through. And I want you really to give careful consideration to each of that, because I really believe that the concept is true for every individual of any generation that we currently have. And I've got some personal opinions on that, but I believe that, especially considering the last couple of years, the current economic events, that the selfish direction that we're heading in the world, that we all kind of consistently are on the edge, and we really need to reflect on that, because when we do reach those moments and it seems like it's too much to handle and 24 hours in a day is not enough and whatnot, I really just encourage you to think about this anecdote that I'm about to share, which is kind of like a hybrid between the two. As you go about your day today, this Monday, and the rest of this week, really take this story with you, because I find it really important. So it's basically a professor stands in front of his class, whatever, his philosophy class, and has these items in front of him. So a mayonnaise jar that's empty and two beers. So that's how the class begins. And what he does, he just wordlessly picks up the very large and empty mayonnaise jar, and he begins putting golf balls in it. And then he asks the students if the jar was full. The students say, yes, it's full, because the golf balls filled it up to the top. But then the professor picked up a box of pebbles, and he started pouring them into the jar. He shook the jar lightly, the pebbles rolled into the open areas between the golf balls, and then he asked the students again if the jar was full. They agreed that it was. The students said, yes, the jar is full. I mean, anybody would probably say that at that first instance. No? So the professor then next picks up some sand. He pours that into the jar, and the sand filled up everything else. He asked those students again, like his class, was the jar full? And again, of course, the students say with a unanimous, yes, the jar is full. So the professor then puts that down, and then he gets two beers, and he puts them in front so everybody can see clearly. And he pours a little bit of the beer into the jar to fill in the rest of the space that was in there, so it drizzles through the sand and whatnot. And then, everybody's laughing and whatnot in the video. And then he goes on to say, look, after everybody stopped laughing, he goes on to say, this jar, and this is the important part now, guys, the jar represents our life. I hope that's clear. The golf balls initially put in are the important things. These are things like your family, your children, your health, your friends, your favorite passions. Those are the golf balls. If we lost everything, and those are the only things that remained, our lives would still be full. I really believe that, because those are the important things that really matter in each one of our lives. And that's different for each one of us. But still, different. Like I said, they're different, but they're still similar to certain regards. The pebbles, on the other hand, are things that matter. They're things like your job, your house, your car, those kind of things. Yeah, that's what those pebbles represent. So, they're just as important, but they're not as important per se. And then the sand is everything else, that small stuff. And then you have all that water, that's just the outside stuff. Yeah, the beer in this case, sorry, is all that outside stuff that just drizzles in between the spaces from time to time. You know, a bill that comes and goes, or something happens that those things just come and go, but they also fill in all that space. That's what that water, that beer represents. Sorry. But see, here's the catch. Now think about this. Let's look at it from an operational process standpoint. If we reverse that and we put in the sand into the jar first, there's absolutely no room for the pebbles or the golf balls. Yeah? Or vice versa, if you started with the beer first. The same thing is true for our lives. If we spend all our time and energy on those small things, we never focus on the things that are actually important to us. So that's the story I really wanted to share with you guys, because to me it's such a basic visualization of life, but it's so straightforward, and I love the concept of this, and that's why I wanted to share this Monday morning, because I want you really to pay attention to the things that are critical to your happiness. Those things like spending time with your children, spend time with your parents, visiting with grandparents, taking your spouse out to dinner, playing another 18 rounds of golf if that's what you like doing, going road biking when you have the time. Those important things, because those are passions. Yeah, those important things is what matter. There will always be time to clean the house, to mow the lawn, all those little things. You might think at that very moment, I need to get the Excel done tonight at midnight because my boss wants it the next morning. And sometimes it is like that. But if your life is like that every single day, you really need to question, again, what the second story was, priorities and time management and where you put all your energy in. But you got to take care of those golf balls. Those are the things that matter. You need to set your priorities. The rest is just sand if you really look at it from a very simplistic views. And that's why I wanted to mention the original two stories first before sharing this third hybrid story. Like I said, that I watched over a decade ago and really had an impact on me. Because if you're going to have a rough day today, something's off, whether you're tired or grumpy from the weekend, whatever the case might be, just remember this anecdote, remember this visualization of life, keep it in your mind, appreciate what and where you are in life right now. That goes without saying. The important things, the golf balls, is what you need to prioritize. The pebbles, the sand grains, your job, all those things are important, but they shouldn't be the biggest focus in life. So, and I want to close out just on a fun note, because in the video, one of the students then raises her hand and says, okay, what does the beer represent? You poured a little bit out, but there's still a bottle and more than a half left. And the professor then smiled and says, I'm really glad that you asked, because the beer just shows that no matter how full your life may seem, there is always room for a beer with a friend. I just find that very interesting. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a beer, whatever it is, but that it's just the anecdote of what the story is. So remember, no matter what is going to happen today, thankfulness goes a really long way. Pay attention to those things that are critical to your happiness without being selfish. The world is a beautiful place. With that being said, guys, kick off this Monday strong, kick it off hard, stay positive, stay dedicated, motivated, committed, all day, every day.